That's a wonderful question, because I think Ravel for me represents a number of things. I would say that certainly precision, certainly elegance, certainly a certain wistfulness, maybe a connection to childhood, also, of course, sensuality, and I would also say a clockwork-like workmanship to every score, at least that I know of. And all of these things are very, very engaging. But not only that, for me, I have lots of connections because of my own upbringing with all of these things. So for me, Ravel's music represents lots of things that I'm personally interested in. My first encounter with Ravel's music, funnily enough, came through Russian music, specifically the Diaghilev Ballet Russe, of which I've always been a great fan and have read I don't know how many books on the subject. So, of course, through people like Rimsky-Korsakov and through Stravinsky, one gets, of course, to Daphnis and Chloe. And I think with Daphnis and Chloe, one hears an amazing, impactful score from Ravel. And for that was the very first piece that I encountered. From there on, then one listens to many other smaller pieces, many other beautiful and well-known pieces. But also I would say that because of the Franco-Russian connection, they also seem to have a great deal of interplay between them. Of course, one thinks of Ravel's own orchestrations for Diaghilev. One thinks of his work on Entre, Rimsky's symphony, which is problematic for Rimsky, of course. But also I think it's interesting to see how Ravel redesigned and reappropriated that work. Also, of course, his own orchestrations for a Carnival and subsequent other pieces, for example, Chabrier's Minuet Pompeux, which, of course, was used by various choreographers. So the dance and ballet and Ravel also go together. And so it was natural for me to move on from there to go through various types of chamber, vocal, and large orchestral works. Ravel's influence on my own compositional work isn't just through the coloristic nature of his instrumental writing, neither just the approach to harmony, but I think also from these aspects I mentioned slightly earlier with regards to his love of childhood, his love of automata, his love of the sound of bells. There are many, many things which, in my own upbringing as a choir boy in the cathedral, every week I would hear bells, I would hear French organ music, because the actual organ itself was a great romantic French organ. So I was surrounded by lots of hints, if you like, as to where my predilections would lie. And French music, per se, was one of the first influences of my own composition. In fact, a very early composition of my own was actually called Scarborough, which was based on the Bertrand poem, of course, after my discovering Gaspard de la Nuit. So Ravel goes back a long way with me. And I would say, of course, through just his immense ability as not just a writer, an individual writer, one who very seldom uses the big prefabricated forms, but is always individual in how he approaches these things. That and the orchestration. And also the different sense of black and white in his work. Of course, one has the sensual Ravel, and yet later on, one can easily have the almost childlike, wistful Ravel. There is a contradiction which he seems to have come to a sort of a peace with. And that I find very, very exciting and very interesting. And of course, built on those things and built on other composers, and hopefully found my own way. But yes, it's interesting to see exactly what influence Ravel has, and of course not only on myself, because there are many Francophiles in England who do rate Ravel's music incredibly highly, and I think justifiably so. I would like to say that actually Berlioz, of course, has a great following and has had for many years in this country, specifically with people like Hamilton Harty back in the 20s. And then, of course, you have much more recent conductors such as Colin Davis, and then you have Andrew Davis, and you have John Eliot Gardner. And there is a well-established recording legacy of these wonderful works of Berlioz, of course, as an immense innovator of the orchestra and of a sense of enormity of idea. But I would also say, I think, that Ravel has had many supporters in this country for some years, for almost over 100 years, I would say. And that goes, of course, through many connections, such as his work with Vaughan Williams, of who they were great friends, of course, and the elder student, Vaughan Williams, thought very, very kindly and highly, and obviously in both directions. But then also, of course, there was the honorary doctorate that Oxford in 1928 gave to Ravel. So you had other connections there. Hugh Allen, there's that lovely photo of Hugh Allen standing next to Ravel, who'd just been awarded his doctorate in his gowns and is clearly very, very happy. And then, of course, there are various performances in the 20s and 30s in England, which clearly brought Ravel before a great audience. And apart from certain types of performer, there, of course, have been certain types of conductor-composer. I think of the late Oliver Knussen, who was clearly someone who benefited from Ravel's music. And one thinks only of Knussen's own two operas to be reminded of Ravel's two operas, especially from L'Espagnole going through to L'Enfant. They are very, very important works, I think, generally. And so I could keep going on with other British composers who've clearly found a spiritual home in the music of Ravel. So I would say there is quite a lot of connection, and especially, I would say, with our most recent conductor, John Wilson, of course, who has done a lot of work on Ravel's music, and I think he's one, actually, of many more. So I do think there are lots of really important connections and have been for some time. Orchestration is a very interesting subject and would probably form the basis of a whole different exchange of maybe an hour or more easily. But I would say for myself, orchestration has been of interest pretty much from the time I was able to compose, and that was from about the age of maybe 10 or 11. And I would say it was because of the nature of, again, the technical demands of the subject, but also the taste and the discernment that one should, I think, naturally develop as one becomes aware of orchestral music and one becomes aware of the functions of orchestration. Going back to Rimsky, of course, one thinks of the great treatise that Rimsky wrote, and there are other books, of course, such as the Vidor orchestration treatise on the modern orchestra, which Ravel very much worked with and used. And I would say that orchestration comes not from only the simple act of instrumentation, which instrument is useful, what can be done in that kind of context. But I would also say that it is absolutely about atmosphere. It is also about emotion, and it is also about being able to manipulate colors with the kind of ability that seems seamless. I do believe that, as Ravel was a great orchestral magician. And the orchestral works that I have always enjoyed, funnily enough, which are many of them are French. One thinks of Dukas, one thinks, of course, of Berlioz, one also thinks of Schmidt. There are many, many composers, Chabrier as well, who have written these wonderfully, just beautifully considered orchestral masterpieces. But then one goes on, and there are many more recent composers, of course, who also have this ear for orchestration. And I think it's the ability to understand what is appropriate, what is within taste, and also what is able to be one's own voice impacting on that. That's the difficult part, I think. And as I teach orchestration myself, that's something that I always try to get across to the students, that it's not just simply of, will this work? This instrument will work with this group of instruments. It's much more complex than that, and it's much more subtle. that's probably one of the principal reasons that I chose orchestration as something I enjoy doing, but specifically with these two pieces. And I would say they are utterly different. Site Auriculaires is an amazing piece, and amazing for the fact that not only was he was so young when he wrote it, but that it actually starts off a whole line of sorts of pieces, not just with him, of course, with Debussy and other people we think about the Habanera, but also with this ability to be absolutely precise in the smallest detail. And one goes to the Sonatine, of course, and one finds that as well. These details, which seemingly are just perfect in their own right, make an enormous canvas. And as an orchestrator, one has to be attuned and sensitive to those. And that, of course, comes from a knowledge of the scores. One also has to have an understanding not only just of what the ranges of the instruments and what the combinations are, but how to paint the kind of accurate and sensitive coloration which will make the piano version come to life orchestrally. The question I find very interesting and somewhat amusing, especially when one thinks of the amount of orchestration of other people's music that Ravel did. Because, of course, he didn't ask Mussorgsky, he didn't ask Debussy, he didn't ask Chabrier. There are lots of responses to that. And, of course, when one hears Ravel and the orchestration, one always remembers that he is clearly deeply respectful of the original, and yet is not simply just making a version that perhaps could have been done. There's a lot of wishful thinking, perhaps. And also, one, I think, has to be aware that there are certain drives, at least maybe in myself, maybe I project, but I like the idea of coming across a work which clearly calls out for an orchestral clothing. And I think the clues are in the piano music. There are clues within the nature of where that piece fits inside a composer's oeuvre. And that's, for me, what makes it interesting. And so I don't think one can accuse somebody of some great sin by orchestrating someone else's work, even if they could have and didn't do it themselves. A little story aside, I studied with and knew Henri Dutilleux, and a very famous piece of Dutilleux's is the Flute Sonatine. And it was a piece which in later life he was somewhat uneasy with. And I remember him being asked by many flute players, will you write another piece in this style? And he was saying, no, it's so old, it's so old, it's so old. And yet, I felt that the accompaniment was clearly orchestrally conceived. And so I went ahead and orchestrated it. And yet, to this day, I feel at some point that maybe Dutilleux will visit me in a dream and say, you shouldn't have. So there is some sense of boundaries, perhaps. But the way I view it is that a good orchestration gives another piece a second life and brings it before a larger audience and hopefully enriches our understanding of that composer. So I would say that there is a good reason to be sensitive to the work of an orchestrator. And I would say also that you are either, if you like, an amanuensis, you are a helper across decades, centuries, or you are seeking to create a dialogue with that piece. Now that means that perhaps you treat the piece and the text with little or no respect, and so it becomes raw material. I have never felt that that would be possible in my own way of approaching that. I think of someone like Andre Caplet, who worked with Debussy, and of course even someone like Ottorino Respighi when he worked with Rachmaninoff. There always is a sense of these are orchestrations which clearly fit the original and yet bring life. And so that's my approach. With regards to the question of are there certain things that orchestration can't do, are there limits? Oh, I would say so. I would say there are certain orchestrations, which I won't mention, which are fabulous, and yet they do not undermine any kind of primacy that the original text actually states in terms of its sonic impact and in terms of its power. Maybe there's one piece I will mention, and funnily enough, it's Ravel. The Marius Constant orchestration of Gaspard La Nuit. I'm unbelievably impressed with someone who's willing to take on something of that size, of that nature, of that density and complexity. And some moments are absolutely brilliant. And yet it's clearly a piano work. And there are certain things which you just cannot replicate. You can make a kind of accommodation, you can make a negotiation with, but I think some pieces will always remain primarily in the best clothing in their original state. When choosing a piece to orchestrate, I would say that the first response that I have is what is my connection with that music itself. And that can come from a long history with it, maybe as a pianist myself at some point. I would have played it and so had an emotional response to it, or that something within the music suggests certain colors immediately. And that's where I usually start with regards to a certain line will be in a certain register, will have a certain atmosphere, will therefore suggest either a single instrument or a complex of instruments. So I start from there, and then there is also the balance of, do I respect the possible probable choice of the original composer? Or do I find a sort of clothing which would be respectful of, but yet move away from? So I think with orchestration, there are lots of different things to keep in balance and things to constantly be questioning everything else as well. So I would say that ideally, and this is what again I tell my students, if you are going to orchestrate something which is in the piano original, then of course listen to as much of the original composer as you can. And also don't just listen to the pieces, but also look at the score, look at the detail. I also say, look at the period from which it came, because that says an awful lot about where the composer has come from and what has been taught and what has been ingrained in the composer. So all of those things, there's a sense of being informed. But then on top of that, obviously, one wants to make one's own decisions, and certain things will speak more to you than to someone else. And that's always interesting, I think, from when one works with a conductor who has also their own ideas about how these things should be. So again, that's a further negotiation. However, I do think that there is a certain immediate response to an orchestration and the act of orchestrating, but also then there's a balance of what one must take on board from that composer. Following on from what I was just talking about with regards to being informed about style, about period, about the composer's output generally, I think there really is a case of course, knowing technically how an orchestra will work, what the best combinations are, what are the most effective and appropriate combinations. But then on top of that, there is just something which guides one, I think, in the sense of the drama, of the nature of the actual narrative of the music. For example, when one has repetitions, literally just repetition marks in the score, and it has to be played twice, I've never really seen the nature or the need to repeat exactly. And yet there are moments where a repetition of exactly the same instrumentation is absolutely what is needed because of the nature of the piece. And I can think of, for example, a piece by Lutosławski, his variations on the theme of Paganini, which was originally for two pianos. In the orchestral version, each variation is repeated, and the piano swaps around. In the orchestral version, we still have the same repetition, except the pianist, the solo pianist, plays piano 1 and then piano 2. And so the repetition has to be rescored because the material is not there. And I think that's very interesting with regards to just what you do with something you've just orchestrated and given that to someone else. So that, for me, is a really nice way of looking at this little puzzle. And I think when one thinks of what Ravel must have gone through, looking at his own piano music, and then making decisions on how that works, and how that could work orchestrally, and what changes have to be made, that's fascinating. And in many ways, the idea of an orchestration book from Ravel, who of course at one point said he would have loved to have done it, and then another point said he would have loved to have written an anti-orchestration book with all the mistakes he had used and made, would have been fascinating. But if you look at the piano originals and you look at the orchestrations he made, that's the text right there. That shows you the decisions he was able to come to, just from a sensitivity to his own work and also from the orchestra of the period. I've known conductor Maestro Ludovic Molo for many years. In fact, we were both students at the Royal College, and we were at Tanglewood together. So our relationship goes back, and it's a very warm one. He also commissioned an orchestral piece from me when he was at Seattle. So I think he may have heard some of my orchestrations on disc, perhaps some Duthier orchestrations that I made, possibly some of the Ravel orchestrations I made from Tombeau de Couperin. And he contacted me and said, would I be interested in orchestrating this wonderful early piece of Ravel? I had this sense of slight palpitation, because looking back at anyone who does a Ravel orchestration, one is always ready to really examine their output and how they've done that. But yet the pieces are so beautiful, specifically Entre, cloches, and they are so advanced for their time, I thought I had to take this on board. The second of the two movements of Sites Auriculaires, with Entre, cloches, is a wonderful, picturesque capturing of a square full of so many bells, so many belfries, so many different churches. And Ravel, within just two pianos, is able to set up polyrhythms, is also able to set up very, very advanced harmonies for the period. One really has to start from scratch and almost unpick the sense of composition, of what's going on. Now, when one has done that, one starts to get a sense of a number of things. One is certain types of foreground, background, and middle ground ideas that would probably work in orchestration. Bass lines, inner harmonies, top lines. Then the second thing is, again, the narrative flow of the piece, which means that as Entre, cloches is a three-section piece, what does one do with the latter part and the opening part? The middle part is much more fairy tale-like, if you like. It is much more, it has a sensual nature. It is much more imaginative in the sense of it's not just the clangor of bells. And so going through these ideas and putting a pin, if you like, in these very specific qualities that come across in the score, then one moves forward with regards to exactly the kind of orchestration one has in mind. Now, of course, the difference between scoring for large orchestra and small orchestra comes into play with regards to how could one get this sense of power and impact, and especially with the polyrhythms with a smaller orchestra. It's possible, it's absolutely possible. But I think personally, the overpowering sense of the sonority of two pianos was best captured in a large orchestra. And also, I think the way that what I've personally done is to slightly enlarge the idea of doubles of sounds. I think what Ravel is really doing is that he's multiplying the reflections on different bells, on different buildings in the piece. And so I wanted to go that little step further. And so one has exactly what Ravel has written in my orchestration. But then there are, if you like, little sonoric kickbacks. So you would have a simple duple rhythm, bop, beep, bop, beep, bop, beep, bop, beep, bop, bop. I have, in a slightly different part of the orchestra, then included beep up, beep up, 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 beep up, up, up. So you have a 2 against 3, again amplifying this sense of, if you like, the collision of bells. And then the slower section in the middle, one of course is absolutely in the beauty of so many different types of Ravel scores, whether it be L'Enfant, whether it be Ma Mère Loire, whether it be even aspects of the Minuet Antique. So in a way there are already orchestral models out there, but as I said before, it depends on my response as well as being aware of the sort of music that Ravel may have coloured. In a way, when I started orchestrating, I started with Entre, cloches, because I felt that that was, if you like, a tabula rasa. There was nothing else orchestrally out there. Then, when approaching and considering the Habanera, one is suddenly absolutely intimidated by the Ravel orchestration, which is absolutely fabulous, and everybody has known for many, many years, and there are many recordings. So my thought was, I'm never going to be able to better that original conception. But what's interesting about the original piano version and the original orchestration is the amount of differences, very subtle differences that there are with regards to appoggiaturas, with regards to the way that certain harmonies are being realized, with regards to certain inner voices. So there are slight interesting differences. And from a point of view of just a researcher, what was fascinating was to see exactly how Ravel then got around certain issues of the piano in the orchestra. So I would say that a lot of the difficult work of how to realize the original into the orchestra had of course been done. Moving on from that, however, I had to, if you like, go exactly against Ravel's ideas. So I came up with the idea of a kind of negative orchestration. And this idea comes from the fact of, if Ravel had used strings, I had to use winds. If he had used certain types of harp sounds, or if he had used certain types of harmonic sounds, I would find an equivalent, but a different voice and a different orchestration. Of course, there were times when there just wasn't another way. So one had to make peace with the original being maintained to a certain extent, even just in atmosphere. But it was a case of trying to reveal different pathways in the original piano version, two-piano version, that one didn't hear in the orchestration that Ravel left us. So that was a lot of fun. And it also, as I said, did teach me a great deal about how a composer revisits their own work. I think the difference between the larger, more dramatic sites auriculaires and the gem-like sense of miniature that one gets in the sonatine, in a way is absolutely the extremes, as you suggest. But in a way, again, the personality of Ravel absolutely completes them and has them as one equally viable unit, squaring the circle. And for me, there are many, many moments in Ravel's music where one gets these enormous contrasts. And I think with the sonatine, even though there are, I think, a much more compact and gentle, perhaps, but certainly almost wistful nature of the music in comparison to sites auriculaires. Of course, Ravel had visited that type of music many, many times in the rest of his output. I mentioned before, of course, Ma Mère Loire, and also, of course, in Tombeau de Couperin, Menuet, Toccata. And so in a way, there are models there, not specifically orchestration models, but just atmospheric models, the way that Ravel thought about color changes, not with regards to the specific instruments and how that works, but going from one type of primary color to another type of color and how that changes across the piece. So for me, having also orchestrated 2 of the tombeau movements already, there was a sense of I had a way in. But what I wasn't prepared for when I actually started work on the orchestration was that Ravel's ability to develop very small units, just from a compositional point of view, not only was astounding, but also that gave me other ideas on how to orchestrate those things. So I tried to find different ways of keeping things in touch and in common throughout the movements. It's funny because as an orchestration teacher myself, I don't know how many times I've actually worked on this piece with orchestration students, the whole thing or just maybe certain movements. But I would say I never realized just what kind of depth there was in the piece. So it was an absolute pleasure to orchestrate it. And so one takes the problems and the challenges, and I hope the result has and will be something that will at least feel Ravelian.